If you're a Canadian and you've looked at your phone bill, caught a flight across the country, or bought any kind of food product, you've noticed something. Things are freaking expensive. As we're all grappling with these headlines surrounding inflation, pushing prices even further, there is one overdue conversation we need to have about this country's industries. This is Canada's oligopoly problem. This topic caught my eye for a number of reasons. One, I'm a Canadian paying exorbitantly high bills for my cell phone, air travel, you name it. Another reason is that it's been a reader reaction that came up quite frequently in my reporting, particularly when I worked at B&M Bloomberg. One story that stuck out with me was when US airline JetBlue Airways announced that it would be swooping into Canada for the first time. This drew absolute praise and enthusiasm from Canadian readers, and it wasn't just because of airlines in Canada stiffing passengers and withholding refunds during the pandemic, which is another topic I've covered. No, it was because Canadians were eager for more international competition in the airline industry. During a slowly recovering global travel market at that time in April, some countries were taking flight faster than others, whether it was because of pandemic aid or just because of government policy. The airlines aren't alone in this oligopoly problem, and Canadians are demanding more out of their government and calling for more market competition. This video will be a bit of a departure from my regular format, think tighter sections in a lightning fire round. But anywho, let's first dig into this idea of an oligopoly. Simply put, oligopolies are market structures with limited competition. Think of a market or industry with a small group of large players. An oligopoly can maximize profits, set the price of goods and services rather than being price takers, enforce high barriers to entry like economies of scale, technology patents to name a few, to crush any new budding competitors. And there are usually so few of them. Right off the hop, you can probably think of a few examples in this country that follow these traits, but allow me to go over them in more detail. The telecom sector. You know the biggest players as Rogers, Bell Media, and TELUS, which collectively hold a whopping 91% of the total market share as of 2017. The lack of competition in this space is contributing to sky-high cell phone bills, having Canadians spend 20% more than Americans and 170% more than Australians on their cell phone bills, according to data from CanSumer. CanSumer found that Canadians tend to spend $74 a month on 2 gigabytes of data and $87 a month on 5 gigabytes of data. This leaves Canada with some of the highest data plans in the developed world. Telecom companies tend to argue that prices should be expensive given the vastness of Canada's geography. However, you could say the same thing about Australia, and yet Canadians are still paying a lot more. CanSumer's report also pointed out that each telecom's LTE coverage actually covers less than a third of Canada's total landmass, largely being focused in more populous areas. So we're told that we're paying extra for broad, comprehensive coverage that happens to be neither broad nor particularly comprehensive. The big three tend to be unchallenged for a number of reasons. Largely, they hold the oligopolistic structures I described at the top of this section, and there are other factors like restricted foreign investment, limited access to wireless spectrum, and further privatization and acquisitions. That last point is particularly relevant in recent months given the CRTC proceedings in the Rogers-Shaw deal. Edward Rogers said to the board that the proposed $26 billion takeover of Shaw would actually increase competition in Western Canada and would help Canada compete internationally in a market of content providers. This of course comes after the turbulent Rogers family saga, which, yeah, I should probably do a video on that one of these days. Anywho, there are a few special interest groups, like the aforementioned CanSumer, which are encouraging consumers to take action by making their voices heard to the Minister of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. I'd make a joke about government, but I'm afraid it won't accomplish anything. Anyway, moving along now. The banking sector. Canada has what's called the Big Five. Canada's Big Five includes the Royal Bank of Canada, the Toronto Dominion Bank, Bank of Nova Scotia, Bank of Montreal, and the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. The other two larger banks that are not part of the Big Five include Laurentian Bank and National Bank. The Big Five banks have all the hallmarks of an oligopoly, keeping innovation somewhat subdued and setting the prices for the industry. It's tough to get a precise figure on how much Canadians spend on banking fees, but a global news report worked it out that the average millennial shelled out about $760 over their lifetime up to 2018 when the article was published. For boomers, the figure was $2,200, and for Gen Xers, that number reaches $2,800. And so when the banks hiked prices during the pandemic when they were still making pretty high profits, Canadians were less than impressed. Another thing Canadians have is utter loyalty to their banks. So much so that data from ratehub.ca found that only 17% of Canadians switched financial institutions over the past 3 years. Now, I'll admit I'm one of those people who banks with their parents' bank, and I had that account as a little kid. I know more millennials and Gen Zers are going to largely digital institutions like Tangerine, but I'm an old soul that doesn't like change. 26 is the new 56, am I right? But I'm not alone. That global news report also pointed out that Canadians of all ages tend to stick with the familiar bank and might not be paying that much attention to the costs and the abysmal savings rates. They're also anticipating this logistical nightmare if they do make that shift to another bank. There are a few impacts that this banking structure has beyond price, and these next few opinions will be expressed by a Canadian fintech company called Coho that is directly competing with the bank, so yeah, they have an axe to grind, but they also have some valid points. One, it tends to block new competition from entering the space, which I think is true to a degree. I mean, you still see these smaller fintechs entering the space, not to the same scale as these banks, obviously, but I don't see the competition being as rigid as, say, the telecom industry. Two, they're slowing down innovation, and finally, the author accuses the banks of prioritizing market share over customers' best interests. It should be noted that the federal government did invoke some banking ownership rules in 2001 in an attempt to encourage more competition, largely by categorizing the banks as large, medium-sized, and small, and had an allocation of voting shares within them. With more small fintech companies cropping up in the Canadian landscape like EQ Bank, Simply, and Tangerine, I think the Canadian banks will have to get a bit more creative here. There's not enough competition here in my mind that would even come close to breaking up this oligopoly, but I do think it gives Canadian consumers a bit more choice, and in the age of social media, consumers can really easily express their displeasure with banks, so it's starting to put financial institutions more on notice. Enough notice to change anything? Probably not. Anyway, on to the next oligopoly. Everybody needs to eat. That's what makes this next sector a tough one. In Canada, the grocery sector is dominated by Loblaws, which also owns Shoppers Drug Mart, Sobeys, which also owns Safeway and Farm Boy brands, and Metro, all coming in at a collective 59% of the total market share. With these three big grocery chains, you tend to get your typical issues like price competition. That's even beyond the bread price fixing scheme at Loblaws, which was reportedly an industry-wide problem. The largest grocery chain was alleged to have artificially inflated the price of bread products by $1.50 between 2001 and 2017, working in cahoots with bakery wholesalers. That's right, in cahoots. Allegedly. But at least Loblaw sent a $25 gift card to the consumers that were impacted. In October 2020, it was also reported that two of the big grocers, Loblaw and Metro, hiked supplier fees. Analysts warned that this move could lead to even less competition, and those prices would likely be passed on to consumers. Furthermore, Loblaw, Sobeys, and Metro really put themselves back on the bad map last year when they introduced a pandemic hero pay for its frontline workers with a $2 an hour bump, only to yank it back within the same year. To be fair, Sobeys did bring it back, but only after a wave of criticism and after being dragged in front of the House of Commons committee to testify why they got rid of it in the first place. And I get it, grocery stores tend to have a very thin profit margin, ranging from 1% to 3%, but it is a very bad look when you cut off your frontline workers who are overworked dealing with anti-masker nonsense on top of all of the regular retail bullshit that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And old Hughesy definitely got a taste of that when I worked at Bulk Bar. This topic isn't obviously specific to the pandemic. The price competition issues and the ability to stomp out independent grocers have been widely criticized in the before times and will be widely criticized after. I would say though, the pandemic has certainly put a magnifying glass over it, especially as these large supermarket chains saw revenue growth of over 31% in many cases. This understandably drew the ire of advocacy groups like FoodShare that called out the inequity as people struggled with food securities during the pandemic. Another sector that really got called out during the pandemic is this next one. Of course, we can't talk about Canadian oligopolies without discussing Canada's airline sector, which I kind of mentioned at the top of the video, but let me dig a little bit deeper. Canada's airline industry is a duopoly, which is a type of oligopoly featuring two prominent players. Those two major players are Air Canada and WestJet, taking on about 44 and 37% of the total market share in 2020. Collectively, that's over 80% of the market. All of the other players listed on this chart, over 8 of them to be exact, represent the remaining 20%. Unsurprisingly, this structure leads to sky-high prices, which is a common Canadian gripe. Recent reports from the Globe and Mail found that the average cost of a Canadian domestic flight jumped by almost $100 or 21% compared to 2019 prices, which were already quite high. And you might be thinking that a lot of this comes from the fact that Canada is a broad country with major cities sparsely laid out across a wide geographical expanse. Nah, domestic flights can even be more expensive than international flights like to the US, Europe, and nice sunny destinations. A lot of domestic flights, depending on where you're going obviously, can demand a starting price from mid-200s, mid-300s, and usually it only goes up from there. I get that after a year of travel shutdowns, there might be a rush of demand that's tipping the scales a little bit, but this was a problem even before the pandemic. You can find Globe and Mail reports dating back to 2012 and even some academic papers dating back to 1988 describing Canada's airline duopoly. I wasn't even a concept back then. This is why the airline industry had its hackles up when a foreign competitor from the US, JetBlue Airways, announced that it would be touching down in Canada for the first time. On the flip side, consumers were enthusiastically cheering on this prospect of more competition in the aviation industry, hoping that it might bring down some airfare costs. Underpinning this attitude towards Canada's airline industry came from the way it treated its flyers during the pandemic. I went over airline pandemic price gouging in a previous video and covered it in the Toronto Star, so I'll touch on it briefly here, but if you want more details on that, you can pay my former self a visit and check out that video. Last year, during the height of the pandemic, when borders were just shutting and everyone was rushing to get home, some of the passengers I spoke to for the Toronto Star article were charged between $1,500 and $2,280 for a one-way ticket home, which is utterly bonkers. Furthermore, flyers who had their trips canceled on them were demanding a refund from airlines which had an iron grip on them. This left Canadian Airlines faltering in the court of public opinion as they held on to money for services not yet rendered, at the same time that they were taking on pandemic aid from the government, pretty much taking a double dip out of many Canadian taxpayers. So those are some of the oligopolies this country has, but what really helps these structures take root in this country? It's likely influenced by a number of factors depending on the sector, but let me dig into a bit about competition laws in this country in this next section. Competition policy in Canada, which examines laws and policies to promote more equal competition in the country, is spearheaded by the Competition Bureau, which is led by the Commissioner of Competition, or the Competition Commissioner. This organization also enforces competition through the Competition Act, which was last revised in 2009, and the last time before that, according to a speech by former Competition Commissioner Melanie Aitken, was in 1986, so you can see how often these laws are actually looked at, which is a problem in our digital age. According to a report from the Center for Media, Technology and Democracy at McGill, a lot of our core competition policy actually took its roots in ideologies from the US in the 1960s through the Chicago School of Economics. The report described that one of those leading thinkers was Robert Bork, who wrote the Antitrust Paradox, arguing that antitrust laws were not intended to create an equal society so much as to make it more efficient. At its core, the book argued that while the law should prohibit cartels fixing prices, dividing markets, and creating monopolies, other aspects of antitrust law that Bork considered exclusionary, like vertical agreements, should not be prohibited. This influential book has been criticized for taking on this efficiency over equality attitude that this McGill report actually said became very pervasive in North America at the time. The spirit of that attitude became deeply ingrained in Canada's 1969 Interim Report on Competition, even continuing to have influences over competition today. Part of the challenge in recent years that former competition commissioner John Peckman noted in a 2015 speech is that it's becoming increasingly challenging for regulators to keep up with this rapidly changing technological environment and to keep up with consumer needs. I would argue that rapid changes in technology is exactly why it's so important to keep amending these laws to keep up with the current environment and make it so that competition law becomes the most beneficial for economy and society. In summary, many critics are quick to point out that this system simply needs an overhaul. While we have this growing chorus of frustrated consumers and media reports that keep these price competition issues in the spotlight, there hasn't been a very robust response to actually amending competition law and tackling oligopolies in this country. In an article on this.org written back in 2018, the author made a note that even the most progressive politicians are seemingly losing interest over these issues, meaning that it's up to Canadians and consumers to keep raising awareness and keep demanding more from the government. Anyway, that's the video. I gotta fly now. Just kidding, airfare is too expensive. But in any case, seriously, thanks for watching. If you like the video, like, comment, subscribe, do any one of those things. You don't have to do all of them. I'm not greedy. I'm not an oligopolist. But that's a twofer. But seriously, this is Stephanie Hughes signing off.